One of the topics that's been discussed is shrinking the size of government. I think you've suggested a few agencies you'd like to see done away with, including the Department of Education, Housing and Urban Development. Are there others? Energy, Veterans Affairs, what?
Certainly not Veterans Affairs.
Well,
that's one of the few things the federal government does have business doing.
Right. Okay. What other departments or agencies would you like to see?
Now, education, housing and urban development, energy, possibly labor, possibly agriculture.
Why labor, out of curiosity?
Labor is an activity that, by and large, takes place in one state at one time. It's not an interstate commercial transaction. Now, there might be circumstances in which Congress would have some authority to regulate labor. For instance, labor that takes place along channels or instrumentalities of interstate commerce in airlines, in interstate railroad systems, things like that. But they would be limited. Labor is something that should be regulated most appropriately by state and local governments. They have authority to do that. And the same with all these other things. Housing and urban development and education. Those are things that are most appropriately handled by states. Because the federal government is supposed to be a government of limited powers. And powers not granted to the federal government are supposed to remain with the states.
Okay. And agriculture, I guess there is typically some interstate commerce in agriculture, selling food and processing and things like that.
I mean, if you're talking about regulating interstate commercial transactions in a particular product, then yeah, Congress has some authority to do that. But if you're talking about how much grain somebody can produce in Iowa, that's a real stretch to say that that's interstate commerce. It's a stretch that the Supreme Court's been willing to make since 1942. But it's a stretch that I disagree with. And Congress, I think, has an obligation independently to review the scope of its power, separate and apart from what the Supreme Court says it may exercise without interference from the courts.
Okay. Some of the other candidates in the race have suggested EPA is one that maybe should be done away with. Do you agree with that?
Well, EPA is an entity that has authority to do a lot of what it does, in the sense that Congress does have authority to regulate, for instance, a power plant in Utah that burns coal in Utah to generate electricity that is then sold to California. And then there are emissions that come up out of the smokestack at that power plant. Those emissions move interstate. I view that as an interstate commercial transaction and something that Congress can regulate, in part because it's interstate commerce and also recognizing the fact that no single state could effectively regulate that smokestack, even though it's having very direct effects interstate as part of an interstate commercial transaction. So whether or not EPA needs to be its own independent department is a separate question. I don't see any constitutional issue in that. But the constitutional issue as to EPA's ability to exist, or better stated, as to Congress's ability to make laws to protect the environment, there are many, many circumstances in which Congress has that constitutional authority. Now, how that authority is exercised is a separate question that has to take into account all sorts of public policy issues. But yeah, that's not one that I would look at and say, oh, everything they do is unconstitutional.
What is something that you think the federal government does well and should do more of?
Defense.
Defense. You think defense spending should increase?
Well, I think defense spending should remain at least where it is, and I think defense is one of those areas where we always ought to leave the budget at least where it is, if not increase it. But yeah, it's one of those things that it does well. It's one of the few things it was intended to do, and it ought to do it extraordinarily well. Fortunately, it does. We have the best military in the world, but we've got to make sure we stay on that track.
Okay. You mentioned you'd like to see parts, I guess, of the Department of Agriculture disbanded. Would that include subsidies for?
Yes.
You'd like to see subsidies for mining and grazing as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Meaning an end to them.
How do you I'm sure you
Wait,
probably...
what do you mean by grazing? Grazing isn't an activity that the federal government subsidizes.
Well, in as much as
Subsidizes
you pay low rates to graze cattle on federal land.
Yeah, well, that's different than a subsidy, though, because the federal government owns
Well,
huge...
if it's below market rates, you know, if you're paying less to graze on federal land than you would pay to graze on private land.
But I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure it's the case that you pay below market rates at least in our state, since the federal government owns 2/3 of the land in our state.
Yeah.
The government essentially has a cartel on the grazing market, and so it can charge whatever it wants, and it could get away with it. Whether or not it sets those rates too low is a policy question for Congress.
But generally speaking, agriculture subsidies are something that you would like to see ended. Why is that, and how do you explain to rural Utahns who receive a lot of agriculture subsidies that that's something, a policy would be beneficial?
Well, the government shouldn't be in the business of business. That's up to people who are themselves making money. Whenever government tries to subsidize something, it's saying we're going to pick the winners and the losers in the business field. And I don't think that's the place of government, because the government can't create wealth. It can only spread it around. It can only reallocate or redistribute it. And I don't think that's the appropriate role of government. I especially don't think that's the appropriate role of the federal government.
And so those rural Utah farmers who might have, I guess, they might be hurt by it. It might be an adjustment period. You think that they're capable of riding out a transition as these things are phased out? How would it be phased out over a period of time?
It would have to be. Anytime you have a large federal program that spreads a lot of money around, it would have to be phased out.